Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Beatrice Dupuy, and I'm professor in the departments of French and Italian and Public and Applied Humanities here at the University of Arizona. And I am co-director of Circle. Before we get started with this webinar, I have a few announcements that I would like to make. Circle is housed in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona and is one of 16 language resources center funded by the U.S. Department of Education. On this slide, you have the link of Circle's website and the link to the Language Resource Center's general website, where you can find out about the work we all do and access our free resources. And I will be pasting both links in the chat afterwards. Included in this slide are two upcoming webinars that will take place in April. On April 7th, Kristen Michelson will consider ways to engage learners in reading multimodal web text. And on April 21st, Sonia Colina and Sarah Albrecht will discuss the role that translation can play in the multilingual classroom. On this slide, we have included the theme of our upcoming 8th Intercultural Competence Conference, which will be held in late January 2022. Decentering mobility in intercultural education, engagement, equity, and access. And our lineup of plenary speakers is on this slide. The call for papers is out, and the deadline to submit abstracts is June 4th, 2021. You can find additional information at the link posted on this slide, and I will also post it on the website. Today is webinar 1 of our first spring webinar series. So the presenter of today's webinar is Dr. Sebastien Dubreil. Sebastien is professor of French and Francophone studies and second language acquisition and technology enhanced learning at Carnegie Mellon University. Specializing in computer-assisted language learning and second language acquisition, his research interests include the definition of culture in the L2 classroom, its place in the curriculum, the assessment of culture learning, and the use of instructional technology in setting up effective language learning environments to foster transcultural learning. And most recently, Sebastien's research has led him to investigate the notion of social pedagogies, social justice, linguistic landscape, and game-based language learning. His research has appeared in numerous journals. He's also, alongside Dr. Willis Allen, co-authored Alliage culturel, la société française en transformation, which was published by Cengage Learning in 2014. He also co-edited Engaging the World, Social Pedagogies and Language Learning, published in 2017 with Cengage, and his most recent publications are Language Teaching in the Linguistic Landscape, Mobilizing Pedagogy in the Public Space, co-edited with David Malinowski and Hiram Maxim. And he co-edited a special issue of the Calico Journal entitled Innovation and Creation, the Maker Movement, which was just released. So I will post in the chat links to several of his most recent publications that might be of interest to this audience. A number of them can be downloaded for free, and open access publication will be marked with 2 stars in the chat. So with no further ado, I will leave the floor to our presenter, whose webinar is entitled Exploring Multimodal Literacies Through the Linguistic Landscape in the L2 Classroom. Sebastien, the floor is yours.
As the title indicates, we're really going to explore today, and hope you'll come along with me, trying to see what multimodal literacies are, how we can use them, and what the linguistic landscape has to do with all of this within the framework, I guess, of language and culture learning. So the first questions that I would like well, let's start with the citation because I like that. Steve Thorne, back like 10 years ago, in a emerging article, said that the goal of foreign language education is to catalyze the development of anticipatory dispositions that enable complex, nuanced, recipient-aware, nimble, and improvisational communicative capacity. This is Steve Thorne, so it'll come at no surprise that you have long words, but joke aside, what he means is that we're trying to get students to be more sensitive to the communicative settings and context in which they find themselves, and hopefully equip them to actually handle these contexts and exist and interact with them. So why multimodal literacy? So if you want to use the chat and just brainstorm what do these terms multimodality or multimodal literacies and why we need them evoke for you. So I'll let you type for a little bit. What is multimodality? Why do we need multimodal literacies?
All right, so we are starting to see a few things coming. We need them because we live in a world of multimodality beyond the classroom, and our instruction should prepare students for that kind of world. Multiple reading resources, language is just not verbal. Different ways to learn that appeals to all senses. I would say multimodality is the use of multiple semiotic resources to open students' mind and be aware of diversity in all aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Many ways of meaning making.
Oh, I like that.
Multimodal text, we're looking to visual presentations, use of space, use of visuals. Many types of registers for communicative exchanges. If multimodal tests are everywhere, multimodal literacies are needed.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, so you guys intuitively, or you all, I should say, intuitively own in on or zero in on the challenges is that despite the fact that we all understand that language and ways of communication are multimodal, and they've always been, and they always will continue to be, even oral speech is not just relying on the words that are coming out of our mouths, but also on gestures, facial expressions, intonation, rhythm, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're superimposing on this all sort of technology mediated sort of instructions. And yet, for reasons that continue to defy understanding, we have decided to offer or to grant primacy to print and writing as forms of literacies. And this is incredibly reductionist, one, and two, as many of you have already pointed out, it doesn't really serve the students not only to learn the materials that we're trying to teach them, but also I think the first answer alluded to that we need to instruct them how to participate in the world around them, be it professionally, personally, affectively, and so on and so forth. And all of these forms of participation will most likely be multimodal, right? So teaching students to understand and exist in the world is, I think, what we're after. So just a little quote from Jewett in 2009. He said, multimodality describes approaches that understand communication and representation to be more than about language, and which attend to the full range of communicational forms people use, image, gesture, gaze, posture, and so on, and the relationships between them. So I listed 5 modes. There is more. We're not going to debate about the epistemological, postures around how many modes there are. But the textual mode is the one everybody understands. But there's visual, audio. Moving pictures and still pictures. Audio, both orally and speaking, but also what you hear. Spatial, gestural, et cetera, et cetera. And Günter Kress, who is one of the heavy bats, if you will, a leading theorist in the area of multimodality, said in 2010, or wrote rather, mode is a socially shaped and culturally given semiotic resource for making meaning. Image, writing, layout, music, gesture, speech, moving image, soundtrack, 3D objects are examples of modes used in representation and communication. So while we understand the different kinds of modes that he lays out, the most important part of this particular citation or quote is the socially shaped and culturally given, right? Even if you stay within the same mode, images do not make sense the same way in every culture, right? Or even within the same culture across different cultural groups. The idea of multimodality borrows pretty heavily from the systemic functional linguistic of Mac Halliday, and who identifies 3 functions for modes. One is the interpersonal function, meaning that you speak to an audience, or communication media speak to audiences. The ideational mode, which is that these different modes express ideas, values, beliefs, emotions, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the textual, broadly defined, right? We can take a picture as a text, or an infographic as a text, et cetera. Have a materiality. They manifest in the world in very specific ways. And this materiality of the sign is open for interpretation and meaning making, okay? So before we keep on moving, I'd like to really emphasize the multimodality, in the sense that, as you pointed out so eloquently in the chat a little earlier, we cannot pretend that people communicate today the same way as they did 10, 20, 15, 20 years ago, right? The world of communication, as Cress says, has changed and is changing still. And the reason for that lies in a vast web of intertwined social, economic, cultural, and technological changes, right? So not only are the modes interconnected, which is the multimodal aspect of signs, right? You can have something that is just written, but you can also have something that has an image and a text, or you can have something that has text and an audio soundtrack, et cetera, or you can have everything together, right? So they're interconnected and they work together interactively, right? So they interact with each other. So we move to this notion of just the written word to this idea of semiotic resources. You know, we have this ensemble of signs that make meaning together. But what that also means is that when we teach students, we have to pay attention to the ways in which these modes actually work. So if you teach students with a picture, for example, there are ways to analyze a picture. You know, this is when you call into questions things like what's in the foreground, what's in the background, what's on the left, what's on the right, and is the left and the right privileged the same way in different cultures? Or you know, how are pictures traditionally composed? What do photographers pay attention to in terms of lighting, in terms of framing, in terms of all of these ways in which the sign is being constructed can or maybe need to be tended to in order for students to be better equipped to understand what's going on. And in fact, I would argue that when we show movies in the classrooms, students think that they will understand because it's movies, and they're very familiar with film or series or et cetera, and they cease to pay attention to the form itself, right? And how it actually conditions the way in which they interpret what is being presented to them. And helping them deconstruct and become aware of that wrapper, if you will, is something that is a bit not only challenging, but also needed. So essentially what we're asked to do in face of all of this is what some people call assemblage, right? Or Steve Thorne, again, in a previous presentation a few years ago, called semiotic bricolage, to borrow a term from Lévi-Strauss, meaning that we have all these things coming at us and we have to put them together and interpret them in a way that that makes sense, right? To us, or in general, right? And it goes back to, I think Heather Allen gave a similar webinar a little while ago about design, the design approach to writing. This is what this is. We're designing meaning, right, based on the information that we have. So there is an active approach to the reader here in terms of interpreting the signs that we see or experience, versus I'll pose that to competence as a way of being this sort of passive recipient of, oh, I know about, right, but not really being actively engaged in producing meaning based on the information that I receive. Okay, so far so good. So the implication for this is that, and I adapted this from a figure by Chen that, from about 5 years ago, is that when we have multimodal signs, we have oftentimes nonlinear reading path. And by that, I mean that if you read a text, although we could debate this, but if you read a text, chances are you read in the order in which your particular language sequences signs, right? So in English, for example, we read from left to right and top to bottom. And oftentimes you do this, even though you can, in reading, go back to what was previously read to see, okay, did I miss something? Which doesn't happen in speaking unless the interlocutor is right here and you can ask to recast, but otherwise speech moves linearly and in chronological order, and you have to sort of hang on to what you can hang on to. But in multimodal signs, oftentimes that path is not linear, right? You have different elements that work together, and there is this back and forth between the linguistic aspects and then other semiotic resources in the sign. So multimodality can be efficient, right? When you combine letters, text, and colors and shapes, you can immediately help people identify what's going on. So in France, for example, which is where I'm from, this very city, Nantes, when you enter the city, every town you enter in France, the sign looks the same. It is a rectangular sign with a white backdrop, black capital letters, and a red rectangle surrounding the name of the town, right? When you exit the city, it is a still rectangular sign, still with a white background, but this time with a black surrounding and a red bar across the name of the city. And you'll see on top of this the name there, you have this little yellow rectangle with D709. That's the name of the road that you're on, because you can exit the cities through different, and they're coded, they're color coded. So blue are freeways, red are big axes, what you would maybe a state route in the US, and then yellow is a smaller departmental road, right? And so sort of what kind of road to expect, and you may think that it's just kind of innocuous, but knowing what kind of road you're on has implication on, even if it's not posted, things like what kind of space you may have, what kind of signage you may find, what kind of speed limit you may find, and so on and so forth, right? All of this is coded through just having these signs, right? But multimodality is sometimes not enough. So here is a sign, and I want to thank my colleague at Tennessee, Carrie Staples, who pointed me to that. In California, on the 110, there was this sign for Pasadena and different exits, and from there you can go on Interstate 5. But it was so poorly marked that this guy kept on missing the exit, and this guy is Rick Enstrom decided that he was going to remedy the situation. So he took his Pantone swatches to make sure he could match the colors, and then he bought a piece of aluminum here that matched the aluminum sheets of the California Department of Transportation, and then matched the font and created a sign. And then he even got a hard hat and a yellow jacket and put a decal on his pickup truck so that I would get in trouble, just so that it was actually meant to happen. And he went and installed it on top of Route 110, right? And he thought for sure that this was going to get taken down, but here it is still today, because maybe Caltrans realized that as you can tell from the whole thing here at the bottom right, you have 5 south, but 5 north was actually very poorly marked, and now it is marked, and apparently Caltrans decided to leave it there. So it goes to show that we're getting into this idea of the public space as a space that is negotiated and potentially invites participation from the citizens, right? So that leads me to my next example, and we'll try this. I will play a few seconds of just the sound of this particular segment. And I want you to imagine, and maybe type in the chat, how you imagine the scene, where we are. It's a pianist, so what might he or she look like, and so on and so forth, right? So let's try this for a second. How do you picture this scene? It is a piano. How do you imagine the pianist?
So the pianist is happy,
The pianist is happy. That's good. I like the going to the affective state.
hurried, intense, frantic, chaotic, in a
In a
suit,
suit.
lots of energy, noisy, in distress. It sounds like they're multiple pianists.
Yeah.
Something will
Solving some
happen
problem.
soon.
Where do you think this takes place?
At a park,
Mm-hmm.
in a public space, at home, open space, public space, theater, at home, in a big hall, a theater, a train station, in a movie theater.
Fantastic. Let's listen a little bit more.
Mesdames et messieurs, votre attention s'il vous plaît, le TER numéro 857 374 à destination du Mans. Départ 17h34 partira de la voie 53. Merci de votre attention.
All right, train station, metro, airport, metro station, movie theater, New York City, at the subway.
There you go. So you see here, just with the sound, you were and getting more clues as we kept on listening to this passage, you were able to extricate or extract more information about what was going on, right? So now let's watch it with a full rendition. Oops. This is the same passage fully with the not only the audio but also the visual.
Mesdames et messieurs, votre attention s'il vous plaît, le TER numéro 857 374 à destination du Mans. Départ 17h34 partira de la voie 53.
All right, so what new information do we get here?
Well, we still get cultural exposition at a train station, a metro station, exhibit. It's a train station. Somebody else says it might be a conference. It's a piano open to everybody.
Yes. So that's a fantastic thing. So yes, so the setting is in fact the Saint-Lô train station in Angers, France. And I know one participant nailed it because she's been through that train station many times. And in fact, in train stations in France now, almost all of them, at least the larger ones, have a public piano. And it is on top of the piano is a little sign that says "À vous de jouer," which is a play on words. It's basically it's your turn, and that's something that you would an expression you would use when you play board games, for example. "À toi de jouer," it's your turn to play. But it's your turn to play the piano, right? And so people can sit down and play. And they do, and then people can clap and vote, which they also do, which is really interesting. And so this was taking place in Angers, France. And I'm wondering how many of you imagine the pianist just listening to the sound as a young black man, right? And I'm not saying you didn't. What I'm saying is that something that crossed your mind, or even if you knew it was Angers, would you have necessarily gone there? And so it goes to show that when you reconcile the audio and the visual, then all of a sudden you have a more or a fuller interpretation of the scene. Okay, so let's now delve into linguistic landscape proper. Could you use the chat once again and finish that sentence for me? Linguistic landscape is?
Everything that allows us to create meaning.
Mm-hmm. Exchanging, I like that.
All text that can be seen in a given space, place. Interaction. All the linguistic resources that are available to make meaning. All the ways we use language. Linguistic landscape is everywhere, even starting with our fridge. How we communicate and navigate in our community. What is around you? Linguistic landscape is social semiotics. Language
Nice.
is occupying the communicative space around us.
Mm,
How
I like
language
that
and
too.
space interact and influence one another.
Ooh.
Much more demanding language use. Anywhere communication takes place.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, that well, I have to keep that in mind because obviously I'm
Advanced
not.
languaging encompasses all the multimodal aspect of communication. What we see in the environment that shows linguistic cues such as text in road sign and commercials. All the semiotic resources. Visibility of language on public and commercial signs in a region.
Mm,
The language surrounding us in multiple forms in public and or private spaces. Shaped by culture.
yes.
Verbal and nonverbal communication. An array of resources to negotiate meaning through language and signs. Everything that contributes to the interpretation of a situation.
Nice. You all should be teaching this stuff. You know that? This is good. So the very first definition of, or at least of linguistic landscape that is taken as the sort of the first one to appear in print was in an article by Lender and Boris in 1997, where they said the language of public road signs, advertising billboards, street names, place names, commercial shop signs, and public signs on government building combines to form the linguistic landscape of a given territory, region, or urban agglomeration, right? So that was the first one. In the aims and scopes of the Linguistic Landscape Journal, which is a somewhat recent journal published by John Benjamins, I believe. It reads, the field of linguistic landscape attempts to understand the motives, uses, ideologies, language varieties, and contestations of multiple forms of languages as they are displayed in public space, right? So you can see that already we move from just road signs and public signage as a, you know, considering the linguistic landscape to something a little bit broader that involves also things like language ideologies and the very fact that, if you can see in this quote, languages are in quotation marks, meaning that there is some sort of debate about this idea of named languages. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of the current debates on the idea of translanguaging coming, stemming from a problem that we insisted on naming languages. And that language really, so there is this idea of name languages as a controversial topic, but also the fact that oftentimes when we understand language, we limit it once again to either two words, and there is much more than that, right? There is visual, and obviously what we're talking about today, this sort of multimodal components of language, right? So here are some examples taken from an article by Ben Raphael Shohami and Trumper Hecht about some examples of linguistic landscape features. So they differentiate between what they call top-down signs, meaning signs that are put there by authority figures like public institutions, for example, religious, governmental, municipal, cultural, educational, medical, etc. Public signs of general interest like PSAs, public announcements, signs of street names, etc., etc. And then you have what they call bottom-up signs that would actually come from people, right? So private business signs, clothing, private announcements, little ads you find on telephone poles and things like this. And you can see here, if we go back to this example that I just mentioned about the guy who put who fixed a road sign, if you will, there's where the top down and the bottom up meet in the middle somewhere, where the top down sign was considered insufficient and somebody made one and just put it there, right? So this idea of having conventions and top-down signs sometimes creates some really funny things. I don't know if you read French, but this is one from Quebec, where you have these ready-made formats or templates. Here it's the municipality of Péribonka in Quebec, and their signs when they do work, that is municipal work, they said, "On travaille pour votre qualité de vie," right? We're working for your quality of life. And in this case, they're talking about renovating the cemetery, right? So that's a kind of a way in which these things can be funny sometimes, where you don't pay attention. You have the template, you don't pay attention to what goes in the middle. But to summarize what you all have already said, when we're talking about linguistic landscape, really what we're talking about is the visibility of language in any form that it manifests. The early interest of linguistic landscape studies was really in multilingual signs in any space. Primarily in urban spaces, but that has broadened quite drastically. And there has been a shift over time from early studies that were looking at mapping the linguistic landscape, meaning where are the signs, on the map, and just counting them, right? To a more qualitative, I suppose, approach with things like geosemiotics, and we'll revisit this as an analytical framework in a little bit. So that this idea of signs in place as being what's called in Scotland called aggregates of discourse, meaning that they're packing in them sort of an ideology and a perspective and an author and a reader and so on and so forth. So we are calling into question issues of authorship, of readership, function, materiality again. How are these signs made? What are they? And placement, where are they placed? And there is this, there is also an extension of modalities, which will not go into everything, but to include things like soundscapes, the audio landscape, schoolscapes, the landscape of the schools, and we'll talk about this. And I know Rob Troyer is in the attendance. That's really his specialty, and even smellscapes. What the landscape smells like. There is an app that I have on my phone for which I had great hopes and it didn't materialize, which is Smell PGH, Smell Pittsburgh, where Carnegie Mellon is. And I thought that people were going to describe the smellscape of Pittsburgh in very eloquent terms, but it turns out that this is just an app to see potentially detect where pollutions may occur. And so there's really not a whole lot going on there, and that's very disappointing. But anyway, let me talk about a couple of analytical frameworks that have sort of asserted themselves as dominant ones, but they're not the only ones by a long shot, but they're the ones that will inform most of what we talk about today. One is the study of geosemiotics and nexus analysis based on the work of Scullin and Scullin, which really looks at a complex relation or relationship between discourse and action. Right, so it's inspired in great part by the sociology of Pierre Bourdieu. So it's calling into play issues of power, language and cultural ideologies, history and practice. It's also inspired by the work of Irving Goffman in the presentation of self and so on and so forth. And in this approach, the idea is that action is mediated by mediational means. That is to say, cultural or semiotic tools ranging from language to material objects used by social actors for a purpose, right? So even small action can be nested in larger social discourses. So in geosemiotics, we examine where the signs are placed, by whom, to do what, and examine how these signs mean to the people that traverse that space, right? In the top right corner of this picture here, this is an example of what I mean by this. You see a map that is a stylized map of Pittsburgh. The green dot here is Carnegie Mellon University. And the map is supposed to represent the neighborhoods around Carnegie Mellon that students might find interesting. And you notice that some of them are colored and named, and others are white and unnamed. And it got called to attention that the neighborhoods that are not named are, in fact, neighborhoods that are predominantly lower class neighborhoods, and where the population is predominantly Black, African American, and other minorities and people of colors. And so then people started to call Carnegie Mellon to task and say, okay, what's the message here, right? This map, this was a plaque that was hanging in the student center, right? And you see how in a hurry the linguistic landscape can become problematic because it conveys a certain ideologies of these are the neighborhoods you should visit, and the others maybe not so much, right? So that has been rectified to my knowledge, but you see how this is where this is going. So the starting point of a nexus analysis is to identify a crucial social action and then to map the cycles of the people, places, discourses, objects, and concepts which circulate through the moment when the social action takes place. And we'll unpack this through a few examples in just a second. The main concern of nexus analysis is to address issues such as how social realities are constituted across time and spaces. In other words, social action exists at the confluence of three key factors: the historical body of the protagonist, so who is there, what are their memories, their histories, their experiences, and so on and so forth. The interaction order, so the pragmatics of the sign and how we use the signs to make meaning, and then discourse in place, meaning how the sign makes meaning in this particular space. Another analytical framework is Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space, where he envisions spaces as something that is conceived, perceived, and lived. And this is a slide that I borrowed from my colleague and good friend Dave Malinowski, where if you look at what we mean by this, the conceived space are things that are planned, designed, legislated, enforced, categorized. The perceived space is everything we can sense with our senses: visible, audible, smellable, observable, documentable. And then the lived space is the experiences, the memories, the associations, the imaginations, the how we feel when we are in a particular space and interacting with it, right? And this theory of Lefebvre's was taken up by Nira Trumper-Hecht, where she was doing some research in Israel, and she says, it's one thing to look at the language that is in the public space, but it'd be even better, and that's the point number 3 here in yellow, if we actually ask people how they experience that space. And so through this juxtaposition of the conceive, the perceive, and the live, this is where we can really find the meaning and the significance of these linguistic landscapes. Okay, and one example of this is a 2009 article by Jennifer Lehman and Gabriela Modan about Chinatown in DC, where they're looking at how Chinatown was established by the Chinese community, right, in DC, and it had a certain visibility of Chinese in the public space. And the users of that space were mostly Chinese speakers and spoke Chinese, but and if you go to Chinatown, Washington, D.C. today, you still see a very vibrant presence of Chinese in the public space, except that there's no more Chinese people, right? They all moved out. And the idea here is that even though there can be a certain vibrancy and currency of a language in the public space, doesn't mean that people are that the people that are in it reflect that vibrancy and that currency. Okay, so what happened in Washington D.C., at least that's the argument of the article, and that's why you need to contextualize the linguistic landscape, is that the authorities of Washington D.C. realized that Chinatown was actually a money-making proposition. It drew tourists, people who were coming to work in D.C. Like going there for food, for the cultural experience, and so on and so forth. And so this started promoting the Chinese-ness, if you will, of Chinatown, and keep it that way so that they could keep on bringing the tourists and the consumers. But the Chinese people moved out for the most part. And even though the Chinese people are still working there, they may be shop owners and so on and so forth. The majority of them don't live in that space anymore. Okay, so that's what they call the commodification of the space, meaning that people come here to experience Chinese culture, or at least the Chinatown version of Chinese culture. But it doesn't matter whether or not the Chinese people are actually there, or what sort of currency Because if the people that are there are no longer Chinese, at least the majority of the consumers, and some of them are, but I'm trying to give you an idea of what's going on here, of the dynamics, then that means that the Chinese in the public space no longer addresses people who can speak Chinese necessarily, but people who identify Chinese as a mark of authenticity. Okay. So a quick summary. The interpretation of signs that we have in the landscape are grounded in and shaped by local contexts, right? We can use either synchronic approach to the linguistic landscape, meaning what's going on right now, or we can use a diachronic approach to the linguistic landscape, which is what Moden and Lehman did, looking at what happened over time. And we can use the linguistic landscape as a descriptive tool just to see what's going on, or we can use it as an analytical tool, right? To sort of diagnose, as Blomart says, what sort of social, cultural structures, ideological structures may be at play and inscribed in a particular space, right? What's called aggregates of discourse, okay? So, are there any questions? Should I stop, summarize? If not, we'll explore a few examples together.
There was one question, Sebastien.
Go ahead.
Asked in the Q&A, could you please repeat who said that? Meaning making.
Meaning making?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody says it.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of meaning making and meaning making potential is I guess the best reference perhaps to and maybe Beatrice you can add this to the best reference to you can add this to the list to go find a nice idea of what this means and how it applies to this idea of multimodal literacies would be to go and revisit the New London Group 1996 article about designing social futures. Ina's suggestion in the chat is fantastic. Ophelia Garcia and Angela Crease and Adrian Blackledge also talk about this, of course. Günter Kress, who's in the New London Group, Jim G, Mac Halliday, ultimately it comes out of that, right? It's a sort of meaning-making potential of signs. That's the Mac Halliday systemic functional linguistics. But so all of these would be good places to go. Does that answer the question? So let's look at a couple of examples of what I mean, and then I'll let you work on a few as well. So my colleague Adam van Kumpenol did a project in Montreal, just looking at the Rue Sainte-Catherine, right, which is this street here, which really traverses Montreal from southwest to northeast. And if you look at in this area is primarily a Francophone area, and this area over here is primarily an Anglophone area, right? And so he counted the signs, and as time went on, I mean, the space went on, he went from a majority Anglophone or Francophone to a majority Anglophone area. The proportion of signs in one language differed, right? So it helps you shape sort of the linguistic makeup of the community. And these are a few examples of things that he found. So here you had Nous Embauchons, now hiring, which was closest to downtown, closest to the Anglophone community. Here, so you had both languages, because Montreal is also officially bilingual, and because you're hiring somebody, it's actually working better if they speak both languages. Here you have Chien trouvé mercredi matin, with a nice grammatical mistake right here. If you look at where this is, Coin de la Rue Sherbrooke, it's actually closest to the Francophone neighborhood. And so people would assume that if a dog was lost in that area, the owner, there's a good chance that it would be Francophone. So the sign is only in French. And here You have enter through the main door, entrer par la porte principale. This is a business, and so even though it is also closer to the Francophone neighborhood, because it is has a functional importance, it is bilingual. Okay. So when you map the sort of this quantitative approach to these examples, you see what I'm talking about. So let's revisit a few things. You already saw Nantes, my hometown. Nantes for a while was the capital of Brittany. And so at some point, people remembered that France was multilingual, and there was this sort of resurgence of regional languages, and so they started having multilingual signs. So you had Nantes, and then below it you had Naoned, which is the Breton name for the city. But as you can tell from this picture, the sign was in different colors, so not official signs. And the Naoned was smaller and in italics and in blue. And so visually, it marked, I guess, a hierarchy of languages, right? Where French was the official language of the country. And then below, there was this sort of timid acknowledgement of the Breton as a presence there. For all kinds of reasons. One of them is that France, to give somewhat credit, is also realizing that they need to better acknowledge and recognize the regional heritages of its nation, as well as very much like the Chinatown effect of commodification. People love going to Brittany for the culture, right? It's a Celtic region. It's marked with a specific architecture, festivals, music, et cetera, et cetera. There's, spectacular coastlines. There's a lot of ecotourism, cultural tourism, et cetera, et cetera. And so it drives business. And so to help this resurgence, or rather surf on it, and as well as be a better citizen, even a European citizen, in recognizing regional languages as part of the makeup of Europe, and in this case France, the signs have progressively changed. So the newer signs show both the French and the Breton in the official nomenclature, and no longer in italics, same size, same everything, right? Because there is one post, you still have to put one on top of the other. So, I mean, I suppose you could still visually, the French is above the Breton, but other than that, they kind of look the same. But this manifested also in all of the other signs. So if you look on the left, these are the older signs where the Breton was always sort of in smaller, below, and in italics. And on the right here, you have the newer signs where you have the French and the Breton in equal with equal billing, right? And this has also now moved into not just the name of places, but also what you would find within a place. Even things like that would sort of, I guess, be in your daily life, like where to park, the name of the street, and so on and so forth. So you have both the French and the Breton, okay? But these spaces can be contested, as you see. So here is another city, Rosé, with the name in Breton, Reudied. And then on the right here, you see that somebody tagged the bottom part here, showing that they don't accept the Breton identity of Rosé, or they most likely consider that French is the language of the Republic, and that there really shouldn't be any place for regional languages in the public space. Okay. But you have other forms of ideologies that are expressed. So here on the left, you have the city of Fougères, which is in the eastern part of Brittany, which has two languages. It has a more sort of, I guess, Celtic-inspired language. And then it has a more Gallo, sort of French-inspired language called Gallo. And so they have three languages in Fougères. They have the French, and then the Breton, and then the Gallo at the very bottom. And on the right here, this one is in Corsica, where you see that in this case, you have the French at the top and the Corsican at the bottom. And it's the French that has been tagged, meaning that this is Corsica, and the French, we don't belong to France, right? So you see that through this interaction between the way in which the space was conceived, there's a disconnect between the way the space was conceived as signage to indicate, to orient people, and the way it is perceived by the inhabitants of this place leads to experiences in that space that are a lot more interactive, contested, and so on and so forth. Okay, there is another one. This is a picture by Rick Kern from many moons ago, when cell phones used to look like this. And this was in a bus stop where, you have 64 emails to send. Nokia is there for you, was the bottom of the picture. And then somebody who's, I guess, against technology said, jette ton portable, right? Throw your cell phone away. But if you see here at the end of jette, they put an S, which is the second person singular form of the imperative in France. And unfortunately, it doesn't take an S. It should be Jette. And so somebody took a marker and said sans S, no S. So if you're going to protest, at least do it in grammatically correct fashion, right? Which gives you all kinds of information about the emphasis that the French still put on language accuracy, even in the public space, especially in the public space, and even in social media. Right? Another extension of participatory culture here, the Efficient Passenger Project, and that's again thanks to my friend Carrie, where people started amplifying or augmenting the signs of the New York, the MTA, the transit authority in New York, because they thought that to better orient passengers how to best make connections in the New York subway. So they created all these signs according to the code, color, font, size, et cetera, that MTA uses, and started posting them in the metro stations in New York. The funny bit in this case is that the MTA was trying to take them down as fast as they got up. And this created this sort of public, I guess, feud through even blogs and things like this. So I just put an excerpt from a blog here just to show you what it does. So people are talking about these interactions in the linguistic landscape between the authorities and the users. And some are citing for the authorities, like this guy, and others are citing for the users, right? So it's interesting. Another example of ways in which we can document the diachronic linguistic landscape this time. This is a game that I got from another good friend and colleague, Julie Sykes, who's at Castles, which is, I guess, a sister NFLRC to Circle. Where in Albuquerque, there's this graffiti artist who's putting graffiti, and then the authorities were working hard to keep the space clean, and so they would paint over. And so this idea was in this game on the Ares platform, which is a geolocative platform. You can take a picture with your cell phone and you can geotag it. So it's great for place-based mobile games. You could, the thing of the game, the goal of the game was to find cool graffiti and take a picture and tag them, right? So before the authorities could take them off, and before other users would actually find that particular graffiti. And so that was the kick. You didn't get points, you didn't get badges, you didn't get a trophy. It was just finding cool graffiti. And so this young woman here is taking this. And then it goes into the platform, and so people can then even when the graffiti was taken down, somebody put another layer here. Art was here before, but if you show up at that space with your phone and the app in that game, you would actually see the wall with the graffiti on it superimposed. It's like an augmented reality thing, superimposed onto the wall, right? So here you have again this sort of multimodal diachronic interaction or historical interaction between users and the space and the semiotic resources that they are deploying in this space, in this case graffiti, to interact with it. Another example of diachronic interactions and the landscape as a site of struggles and competing ideologies. This is the Carnegie Mellon campus, And Carnegie Mellon has a tradition called painting the fence. So this is the fence. It's probably the concrete structure that has the most paint ever, where students can actually paint the fence, and the paint is supposed to stay on there as long as the students are guarding the fence. So people camp by the fence so that their paint can go there, and when they go away, then other students can paint the fence. So back after the terrible assassination of George Floyd by police officers, some students painted the fence with this sign, Black Lives Matter. Right on the day after students returned to campus in the fall, the fence was defaced, and somebody came and painted all here in the back, changing the message from Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter, much to the campus community chagrin. And so it created all kinds of uproar among the students, between the students and the administration, in social media, in the city of Pittsburgh, et cetera, et cetera. So that got rectified. So, the students went back and they painted the fence black again. And then right after the presidential election, that's what the fence looked like. Black votes matter. And just yesterday, that's what the fence looked like. On the one side of the fence, you had more than a month. It was the end of Black History Month. And then on the other side of the fence, you had Protect Black Men, Black History in 2021. And then on the far right here, it reads Protect Black Women, right? So you see how this space, that is a space that is conceived by the university or designed by the university to let students express themselves, becomes a site of of expression of students' identities, but also of struggles between competing ideologies. Okay. All right. So now let's get to work together on this particular sign here, which is taken in the Quartier Montplaisir in Angers, France. And I'd like for you to tell me how you make sense of this sign. What's going on here? It says Marrakech Boucherie Halal. That's a halal butcher shop, right? So how do you interpret this sign? If you want to give me a few ideas in the chat. All right. Cheerful and welcoming, so appeal to the colors. It's in Angers in Western France.
An old lady going to buy the things she needs to cook dinner.
Mm-hmm.
The different fonts are interesting. It's a butcher shop for Muslims. Welcoming to Arabs. Halal meal is permissible to Muslims. Religious food tradition. More than one language.
Mm-hmm.
I assume a Moroccan North African community is nearby. Specific audience. Addressing the customers while keeping the official language. A butcher shop.
Mm-hmm.
More colorful than I have typically seen for a butcher shop.
Yes.
Red color stands out.
Yes.
The combination of font colors and shapes makes it appealing to different people.
All right, let's unpack this a little bit. Yeah, these are all great ideas. So yes, as you can tell, so French being written from left to right, figures on the left side of the marquee here, and then on the other side you have the Arabic, which of course is written from right to left, and so it's really helpful in especially situating both of these languages. It makes a lot more sense to do it this way than to do it the other way around, right? Where you would have to sort of center these two things to go in opposite directions. And yes, there is the colorful thing, which makes it welcoming and happy and everything. And there's also the red, which has been associated with all kinds of ad campaign for food, right? Because apparently red's supposed to make you hungry, and refer to meat. I think somebody said this. And let's pause a little bit for on the font, right? Because you have the Arabic here that tells you it's a halal butcher shop, so it is welcoming to people who might speak Arabic in this community, and it does indicate indeed that there is a population nearby of North African descent. You know the history of France, right? So you know that Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia were both former French colonies, and that there's a strong presence of descendants of Moroccan, Algerian, and Tunisian families in France. That is predominantly Muslim, but not only, but largely Muslim. But the part that I find really fascinating is that if you look at the very top, it is all in French, and the font is a font that is what might qualify it as Orientalist, right? Meaning that it's a font that evokes the Middle East, right, or the or North Africa, but is not at all destined to those populations, right? It is a font that is identified as such by predominantly white, non-Arab speaking populations, right? And if you look at it, it says produits orientaux exotiques, right? Exotic products at the bottom here. If you are yourself North African, or if you're descendant of North African families, a date is not exotic, right? Or eating mutton or is not exotic. This is something that is part of your regular diet, right? And so even though it does advertise in Arabic for Arabic speaking population, the top marquee here is designed to attract a non-Arabic speaking, non-Muslim, non-North African population to come to this butcher shop to get the authentic experience if you want to cook authentic Middle Eastern or North African dishes, right? And it does this through the font, through the color, through what it says, and so on and so forth. So it is the different modes here, the color, the font, the materiality of the language, as well as the linguistic resources that sort of point in that direction. Now let's contrast this to this butcher shop and see what it says, because it also says at the top left here, for those of you who don't read French, 100% certified halal. What is the same and what is different?
So does it imply that Arab customers don't require explanation, but the Francophones do? There's no Arabic. Prices, customers, only French appears. Keeps you on the outside. The font is different, but the color is the same. Different clients shop there.
Right.
Less welcoming. Maybe isn't for everyone. Very specific. This food is not exotic.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Non-French speakers are excluded.
Yes, so French-speaking Muslims are addressed. I like this. Non-French speakers, yeah. So yeah, this sign is really, so it's a more modern, right? So it points to maybe a different historicity for this butcher shop. The one on the left was there longer, and maybe because, to be fair, in terms of quantity, the immigration from North Africa has been it's a long-standing phenomenon, right? Even though it got a big boost right after World War II, right? But right after World War II is 70 years ago at this point, and so the people that are here had children who had children who had children. So now we're on generation number 4. And in a lot of cases, these French citizens of North African descent may or may not speak Arabic, right? So even though they may be, French Muslims and embrace their faith, they may or may not embrace the language, right? So this butcher shop may actually be more modern, and may still target the same population in some ways, the French Muslim population, but doesn't need to do it in Arabic because they may or may not speak it, right? So it is an interesting sort of juxtaposition or contrast. The Arabic in the I would argue that the Arabic in the first sign may or may not even speak to the Arabic population. Right? It may actually speak to the French non-Arabic speaking population who and gives it an air of authenticity, right? But to be perfectly exact, and again, this is where doing a little bit of research on the historical context helps. In that particular neighborhood in Angers, there is still an Arabic-speaking population, right? So it does speak to both of these things. So, all right, let's move on and try to unpack this set of commercials. So just to give you a little bit of context, Breizh is the Breton name, Brittany being the region at the west of France, where I'm from. Breizh is the Breton name for Brittany. And in Brittany, like in many other regions, I have not enough time to get into this, they have started to produce locally produced soda, and in this case, Coca-Cola, right, that they've called Breizh Cola. There was a two series of commercials. One that you see at the bottom here, Breizh Cola, le cola du Far West, the cola du Far West, and I give you a little sort of glossary here at the bottom right. And then the one at the top was in the aftermath of an incident where apparently some hotels in Paris had a hard time supplying or procuring, I should say, Coca-Cola. And so Breizh Cola actually came to the rescue and supplied Coca-Cola for a while. And so let's get some ideas about how you interpret. There's all kinds of things to say about this. There is the verbal once again, but there's also the visuals, the colors, and the image composition. So let's get some ideas going here in the chat. I'm happy to do all the work, but it's more fun if you do some of it. Local Breton pride. That is right.
Breizh is like the Wild West. Oh, the
Yes.
French phare in French sounds like far in pronunciation only. Nice play on words.
Yes.
Language play with phare. So these are coming from people who are obviously
Francophone.
Fun US references with the cowboy hats.
Mm-hmm.
Bottle up in front of American flag.
Yes.
The lighthouse, American flag, and the bottle look similar.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of commercial. I like the US stereotypes.
Yes. So let's go and unpack these things a little bit. So I'm going to start with the top. I'm going to take these things in three moments. First, the top image, and then the one on the right, and then the bottom one with the Far West. So this obviously is a direct sort of recall of D-Day, right? And the liberation of Paris in August of 1944, okay? All the way down to the Jeep, the font that is being used, if you see here in Breizh Cola, débarque à Paris. First of all, débarque is D-Day, the Normandy landing, is le débarquement, right? Le grand ravitaillement means the great supply, and if you look at it went to the detail of getting the font right from the what would appear on the Jeeps that landed in Normandy in 1944. And it's the same vehicle with the flag, this time the Breton flag instead of the American flag that you see here. And the idea of the stereotypical old Breton lady who is tough as nail, wearing black all the time with her white hat. This is called a bigoudaine, comes from northern Brittany, le pays bigoudin, right? As a sort of that would be her combat helmet, right? It's like don't mess with the headdress kind of a thing. And so the imagery refers back to basically Breizh Cola is going to save the day, right? The same way the American GI saved the day in Paris in 1944. Okay, so that's the message right here. If you look at this one, the BZH is the abbreviation for Breizh, obviously. It's a trope that you find in the American cultural landscape all the time, again, referring to that font, just so you know, is called Western Saloon. They use that font as a again, a call to a very specific US imagery of the flag and July 4th, patriotism, let's have beer and popcorn and hot dog and stuff. And in this case, they replaced the Breton flag that you see here called the Gwenadu, the black and white, and they turned it into the blue, white, and red of the American flag, right? The Star-Spangled Banner. And then, of course, the Coca-Cola du Far West, as many of you have pointed out, is the play on word with Far West, and the imagery that again that's called into play here of the which again is a completely fantasized one, because of course the theory of duels in the Far West has been disproven, you know, by historians as not something that, except a few like here the OK Corral episode and things like this, but for the most part this is a complete fabrication by John Ford and the Western genre of Hollywood cinema of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? So and this all gets called into play here in this imagery in what's going on here, and this one in those commercials, in those ads, and this one, as some of you have pointed out, is the Wild West of France. If you've been to Brittany, and this is where this lighthouse is right here, you know that the elements can be pretty brutal, the wind and the water and the ocean and the storms and so on and so forth. And so it is in fact the Wild West, right? So it is reflected here in the way these images are constructed. Okay, now let's look at these two images here and see what's going on. You know, on the left side, you have a young French woman who is demonstrating. And then on the right side, you have a young American woman who is demonstrating. How do you compare and contrast these two images?
So both women are wearing headscarves, American
Yes.
belonging. What does the white scarf represent?
Good question.
Overlaying identity symbols,
Mm-hmm.
protest and submission, French rebellion, perform patriotism or connection.
Mm-hmm.
One is saluting, like maybe to America.
Mm-hmm.
Loyalty and identity. Someone says French woman is face painted, but there's no fraternity.
Yes.
So that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is really fascinating. Just so we're perfectly clear, I don't have a good answer to any of these, right? I'm making assumptions and hypotheses as well. The only thing I know is that both of these women were at protests about social justice in different countries, right? And some of the things that we can say is that both of them are at least portraying, the only two things that we can know for certainty is that both of these young women are choosing to represent themselves as French Muslim on the left and American Muslim on the right, right? And beyond this, your guess is as good as mine. I do not know either of these women personally, so I would have to ask them to know for sure what they were trying to do. But we can point out a few things, like, you know, Kristen, who said, you know, there is no fraternité, right? So if you're a woman, maybe you don't feel welcome into a brotherhood. Maybe you feel better welcome into a sisterhood, right? Or humankindhood or something, but she is definitely advocating for freedom and equality, and she is also portraying herself as French, right, with that flag. The woman on the right chose to portray herself in as an American citizen through the flag that she used as a hijab, right? But she's also showing allegiance to the troops. So is it a discourse on you can be a Muslim and still support the troops, kind of a thing? Your guess is as good as mine, but these things are making meaning in the linguistic landscape is the point. Okay, so you can also have things like hyper localized signage. These are examples of pictures that I found around Pittsburgh at the time of the election. If you do not know Pittsburgh culture, you cannot make sense of these signs. right? Trump moved my parking chair here at the bottom left. If you do not know that in Pittsburgh, when you shovel a parking spot, you put on your street, you put a chair there so that when you return to your home, that, you know, people respect the chair. They don't park in your spot. If you shovel the spot, it is your spot, right? And so that if you don't know this, you can't read that sign. Trump likes Heinz ketchup. If you do not know that Heinz ketchup is from Pittsburgh, then you don't know that that liking Heinz ketchup is equal or equivalent to treason, right? And things like this, right? Or Trump stole my terrible towel is a reference to the Pittsburgh Steelers, the NFL team, again, or cheers for the Ravens, also a reference to the NFL, and the rivalry, the bitter rivalry between Pittsburgh and the Baltimore Ravens, right? So these things show up, and they can only show up in a particular space, and that space is Pittsburgh and greater area, right? So another things that we could look at is how linguistic landscape and multimodality can be understood in terms of space and movement in space. And I talk about the city as palimpsest, which means that people writing the city as they are moving through it. And I'll show you, I may even take down the sound so that I can speak over it. This is David Bell, who is the founder of Parcours, in an interview that he gave to the French TV. It's all in French, so for French speakers. And he's talking about how he moves through the city. And he's talking about, you know, people here may choose to go along this way, but I'm along this passage here, but I'm going to jump this wall, I'm going to jump this car, right? And then I'm going to come back this way, and I'm still cool. You know, I'm still cool. I go this way here. I go up. This is how I go up the stairs, and this is how I come back down. And he said you can find obstacles everywhere. Like this telephone booth can become an obstacle. And he said we feed off of this. This becomes our daily bread, if you will. This is how we move through space. Instead of going up the stairs, I'm going to go up the wall. Instead of going down the stairs, I'm going to jump on the railing, and so on and so forth, right? And so here you have this sort of subversive use of the public space by people who can move through it differently from most people, right? And in doing this, they are actually influencing the space, because people who see them write movement through the city this way start looking at the city differently and interpreting the city differently. What is really funny is that this gesture, which initially was subversive, as I said, is becoming appropriated. And so the city of Innsbruck has asked David Bell and one of his buddies, Cyril Raffaelli, to come to Innsbruck. And the Office of Tourism has sponsored a little clip to showcase the city differently. And look at what it looks like. So you see here, as they keep on running through the mountains, how just them moving through space made people look at the city they presumably live in or visit differently. All of a sudden, they start looking up, they start looking at windows, they start looking at lampposts, anything that these guys hang on to. And they're like, oh, I guess that's a different use of that city, or that's a different way of approaching this particular city, right? So again, you see how there is a different take on this gesture of parcours from something subversive to something that becomes more institutionalized. And because people are waiting for examples, I wanted to show you one more thing before we get there, but I will show you examples of what it means for us as foreign language teachers in just a second. There is this great graffiti artist called The Blind, or that's what he calls himself. That's not his real name, I don't think, who decided to start making graffiti art for the blind, because he realized that people who are blind or seeing impaired cannot enjoy street art the way he would want them to. And so he decided to do these little things with molded plaster that he glues onto walls, to make street art accessible to people who are blind or seeing impaired. And the great thing about this is that he says, I imposed accessibility the way billboards impose advertisements, right? So we're going to put this accessibility into the public space. The other amazing thing about this is that, and again, that's his take on it, is that it also forces a collaboration between seeing people who know where the signs are because they can see them, and blind and seeing impaired people who do not know where the signs are but can read them, whereas the seeing people cannot, right? And he is now currently working to include more multimodality in those signs by working with a serigraphy artist, Guillaume Battista Pina, on ink that can produce sounds, right? So they're going to have both things that blind and seeing impaired people, as well as deaf and hearing impaired people, can enjoy, along with the visual. And all of his graffiti take sort of play on words and on the metaphor of seeing and sight and so on and so forth. So the very first one he did on the left here reads, "Do not touch," which of course you have to touch in order to read, right? So it's kind of, that's the funny part. The one on the right here, "tu gueules, je gueule, tu gueules," it's a colloquial verb to mean to scream in French. So is brailler, which is an homophone to Braille, the alphabet that blind people use to read. And so il braille, meaning they braille, but also they scream, right? So it's a play on word. He did another one on the Palais de Justice, which is the courthouse in Nantes, called "pas vu, pas pris," right? Which means it's a French saying that says "not seen, not caught," right? Meaning by the police if you do something bad. He also did one in a school called Être Miro, which is a recall of the Spanish painter Joan Miró. But Être Miro is also an idiomatic French expression that means that you cannot see properly. And that's how it's spelled, but it's also a homophone. And so in the visual recalls the paintings of Miró, and then the writing says Être Miro, right? And then he went into this really multimedia sort of installation for Les Euroques, which is a festival with visual artists and graffiti artists and so on and so forth, right? So briefly, I know we're kind of over time already a little bit, but what does it mean for us as language teachers? So the place where I started, I thought I would start, is the schoolscape, and how do we make that more inclusive? And this is a project by Corinne Seals, who is in New Zealand, in opening the schoolscape to translanguaging and creating materials that are in multiple languages, so that the kids that are there who are translanguagers themselves can actually feel included and welcome, which is very different from that schoolscape, which is a immersion school in France, teaching Breton through immersive pedagogy, where the signage is all in Breton, right, even though it is in France. But you can also have virtual schoolscape, and I'm borrowing here from my friend Jillian Lord, who is a colleague at Florida, who decided that there was a problem because the information provided on campus during campus visit is really not equally accessible to all people. And there could be speakers of other languages, and there could be people with language processing impairments. So how did she combine this with beacons that she put everywhere on campus, and with a smartphone app? And so when you get to the beacon, it actually, you can choose what you want. If you can have it in the campus store in Spanish and Russian and so on and so forth, and in English as well. And it triggers, when you get close to that beacon, it actually triggers the explanation in the language that you chose. So it makes it more accessible for, say, parents from international students coming, or American students whose parents don't speak English. And what it does is that it fosters this collaboration across campus between different stakeholders, right? You can also do linguistic landscape studies in study abroad programs or contexts, like I did with students in Paris, where I send them and say, okay, read up what an adverb is, and then in your textbook, and then go find me one. And so they went throughout Paris and found me pictures of adverbs so that they get a sense of how they get actually used in real context. While you're abroad, you can also teach students to pay attention to the way the language shows up in the public space and whether or not it makes sense. So in this case, on the left, you have something called the high school bar, because every self-respecting high school in France has a bar nearby, which of course, coming from the North American context, for example, is a complete aberration, right? Or on the right here, some of the words that the French associate with bread, which are very, very culturally marked and may not actually reflect cultures elsewhere. We could also do something I did with my students in Angers, France, trying to rebuild the cultural geography of the city. And I'm not going to run you through all of this, but I sent them to the train station where you heard that pianist a little earlier. An old historical area, which is now mainly a tourist hub and shopping hub for sort of upper class people, and the Marché Mon Plaisir, where you saw that halal butcher shop. And these three spaces are only 2 miles apart, right? And what they found is that these spaces completely reflected the different cultures, but also the different historic moments of the city of Angers, and this is reflected in the language that you see in the landscape, right? Which is absolutely fascinating, and it does require a triangulation of going there, taking pictures, doing some research, and then putting your thinking cap on and trying to understand why these things are there, right? I think Maha a little earlier was wondering about what do I do if I cannot go abroad, or finding examples. You can also send your students to Google Earth VR or Google Street View. This is my colleague here, Stefan Kaspar, in the Ask with Kenner Global Languages and Cultures room at Carnegie Mellon. So here I have students in pairs, and one has a head-mounted headset, and the other one is taking notes of what this young woman is exploring. In this case, she's in Saint-Émilion in the Bordeaux area of France, exploring the wine culture. And so the note taker is there to take, so that it's more efficient that way. It doesn't have to take off the headsets and take notes, but also as a guardian, so that she doesn't bang her head on the walls or anything like this. And then they have to show students what they've found. So in this case, she used Lefebvre's theory of space to show how the wine culture, what values are instantiated and embodied in the public space around the culture of wine, from the way the space is designed, from the way it is perceived, and the way people use it, the way it is lived. So the lessons I've learned along the way to try to do this work with both multimodality and linguistic landscape is, one, get organized, right? Don't try to plan it Tuesday for Wednesday. Train yourself and your students in sort of the methodological frameworks and how to explain to them what signs are and how they mean. Design activities that have clear goals and explain to students how to reach them. Managing expectations, because of course, we all understand that some linguistic landscape studies go for exhaustivity. So you photograph every sign in a street, for example. you probably won't have that kind of time, but you can still do a mini study and show students that that the landscape is not neutral, and it is in fact the site of really important cultural forces that are at work there, and then take your time, right? So this is my last slide. The multimodality is actually anchored in current communication practices and the multimodal realities around us. And so we ought to equip the students to actually deal with them. We need to teach students how to look at something that is familiar to them, even their school, differently. Foster awareness of the public space, even in the school, as a product of histories, cultures, ideologies, and power differentials, and then turn toward action. How can we remedy this? So for example, that map at Carnegie Mellon, how can we put forth a better map, for example? And that was it. Thank you again for your participation, your attendance, taking so much out of your time to listen to me. And thank you again to the Circle staff and directorship. And I'm free for questions if you have any, and otherwise, I wish you a good day.
So Sebastien, yes, thank you so much for this thought-provoking and really engaging webinar that really pushes us to think of ways in which we can make use of linguistic landscape in our classrooms. And there are a few questions, so I'm going to read them to you. They were posted in the Q&A.
Oh,
and
yeah.
So one question that was posted a little bit earlier in the presentation is, could you explain again the diachronic approach to linguistic landscape?
Yes. So the vast majority of linguistic landscape study use a synchronic approach, meaning that we go into a space at a specific moment and we look at what's going on, right? We take photographs, and if we're lucky, we talk to a few people, and so on and so forth. What we're missing sometimes when we do this is that these signs may or may not always have been there, right? So, or they may be they may have evolved over time in a manner that is indicative of historical forces. So the diachronic approach would actually try to look at this. So look at the way a space looked like in the 1900s, and then in 1920, and then in 1950. So of course, in this case, it's not you going in the space and taking photographs, it's you going into an archive and looking at photographs of that particular space, right? And it's a lot easier to do if your research is on the Eiffel Tower than if it is on, my backyard, for example. So we understand this, but you can. So the two examples that I showed were in that aspect were the Chinatown study by Jennifer Lehman and her colleague Gabriela Modan, because you go into Chinatown today and you go into Chinatown 40 years or 30 years ago, and you're like, well, there's Chinese on shop signs and streets and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's Chinatown, right? Okay. But even though the Chinese is constant, who puts the sign and for what purpose is different, right? Because whereas the initial impetus was because it was a neighborhood that was primarily inhabited by Chinese immigrants who install shops that serve primarily Chinese customers, it made a lot of sense for the signage to be in Chinese. The primary purpose of Chinatown in DC today, and again, I'm painting with broad strokes here, but for the sake of argument, the primary purpose of Chinatown in DC today, as in a lot of places, at least in the continental United States, is to provide for passersby, tourists, diplomats in DC, Congress people, et cetera, a authentic cultural experience. But how do we define authenticity, right? So Jennifer and Gabriela's argument is that it is a commodified experience. So we have incentivized, and by we, I mean the DC authorities, have incentivized Chinese shop owners to put Chinese there and keep it there. Even Starbucks has signs in Chinese, which it doesn't in China. Starbucks in China has no signage in Chinese because it's supposed to sell an authentic American experience, right? But it has signage in Chinese in DC to provide or to supply the customers who are no longer Chinese speakers for the most part, an authentic cultural Chinese experience, which is completely manufactured, right? But you only know this if you're able to engage with those spaces over time, right? So that's the diachronic experience or approach.
Thank you. Somebody else is asking, I intend to teach argumentative essay to my L2 class, intermediate level. I'm thinking of using multimodality as a theory. Any suggestions on how to include this in students' term assignments?
That is a fantastic question. And I'm not going to have a fantastic answer, but I will have an answer. The fantastic question is an argumentative essay. So if you want to include multimodality, you're no longer going to call it an argumentative essay. You're just going to call it an argumentative something, right? In the sense that an argumentative essay is a genre that has conventions, and these conventions primarily reside or are predicated upon the written word. Okay, it doesn't mean that we don't do arguments and trying to persuade people differently, but can we still call it an essay? That's debatable. I bet in that case, Beatrice or Heather or maybe Chantel would be even better equipped to answer that question. But in this idea of the sort of this genre-based pedagogy, but what you can do is look at ways in which multimodality exists in vivo, meaning in the real world, for the purposes of persuasion. So infographics or Instagram digital storytelling. In the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, there were absolutely fantastically compelling stories, multimedia stories deployed on Instagram about the Black experience in the United States, right? And it was all designed to convince people and persuade them of what had been the realities and experiences of African Americans in the United States. Do they qualify as argumentative essays? I'm not sure, but they definitely qualify as argumentative and and persuasive, right? And so you might change the assignment and no longer call it an essay, but just look at ways in which you can harness multimodality and offer this to your students. Say, what if you have a prompt, and so you guys read it as an essay, you guys read it as an infographic, and you guys read it as a digital story, and see what are the affordances of and constraints and conventions of each genre, and sort of go with that, right? So that would be where I'd go.
Great. Another question asked by Oslam. He says, terminology-wise, is it possible to use applied linguistic landscape if we are using linguistic landscape research as a pedagogical tool? Or we just have it as a research topic and explorative area to be handled under applied linguistics? Just curious.
So I'm not sure if I'm going to do the question justice. I'm not sure. And I understand the words. Could you say this to me one more time, Beatrice?
Yeah. So terminology-wise, is it possible to use or to say, I guess, applied linguistic landscape if we're going to use linguistic landscape research as a pedagogical tool?
Oh, applied linguistic landscape. Yeah. I would say the cop-out answer to this is that there is no linguistic landscape outside of applied. Precisely because it's the same way that the French sociolinguist Louis-Jean Calvet said, sociolinguistics is linguistics, because he couldn't imagine just looking at language in the abstract the way theoretical, and forgive me if there are any theoretical linguists in the audience, but for him, you look at the language system in a book, and what does that tell you? Because language is always the only access we have to language, really, unless you're in a lab or unless you write it in a book and you exclude people, is in the form of discourse, meaning language deployed in the public space in some way, form, or shape, right? Orally, in writing, in pictures, if we approach the multimodality. And so the linguistic landscape is always situated historically, geographically, culturally, ideologically, politically, and so on and so forth. And so in that sense, I could not imagine a linguistic landscape project that wouldn't be applied, right? So I don't know if that answers the questions, but in terms of the terminology, the other bit of that question that I think, or maybe an extension or reframing, is that it is worth it to teach your students the tools to unpack what they're looking at, right? So I'm not sure you want to shy away from telling them that, and you can use you can use the layman's terms to do this, but when a sign is put in place somewhere in a space, it does matter that they know what a sign is from a theoretical standpoint, what semiotics is, what emplacement might mean, authorship, readership, and so on and so forth. So, and that that where the sign is in space, what color it has, you know, all these things, the visual vernacular, so expressions like this that help students talk and describe the realities that they live in every day. I think it's worth it. It's equipping them intellectually to deal with the reality. So I wouldn't shy away from the terminology.
So another question that I think is kind of related to what you were just talking about. Somebody is asking, can linguistic landscapes be understood as a symbolic territory that is invisible to people? Considering people communicate on diverse social media platforms more often than in the past, a certain group of people establish their own linguistic landscape on social media to communicate, where culturally different people cross over the border of linguistic landscape easily and experience other cultures.
Yes. So that's the easiest question, because I could just say yes in all caps and then that'd be the end of it. But just to give you a little bit more detail, I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head, right? In the sense that that's what I mean by defamiliarizing the familiar, is that people have to be aware that that's why I guess Hall and Hall call language culture the silent language, right? Is we live through space without questioning it. C'est normal, right? It's normal. Normal means it's the norm, and somebody has to decide on that norm. But because it's the norm doesn't mean it's the best way of doing it, or doesn't mean that everybody is included in that norm, or are only a few people included in that norm, right? Nira Trumper-Hecht, to recall somebody I already named, in her study of the linguistic landscape of Israel. So she was looking at signage and she's like, oh, it's all Hebrew. It's in Israel, right, where a significant portion of the population is Arabic speaking. So she had signs in all Hebrew historically. And she's like, all right, well, that excludes a lot of people. And then the second language that appear on signs, even in tourist areas that would be highly trafficked and so on and so forth, with English. And so you had Hebrew and English, but still no Arabic. And eventually you had Arabic. And so again, it goes to show the difference between the vibrancy or the presence of language and the currency or the symbolic force of this language in the public space, because you had Hebrew, English, and then Arabic. So like, all right, progress, there is Arabic there, fantastic. But when you actually read the content of the size, it made little to no mention of the Arab people, right? So there was Arabic, but no Arabs. It recounted the history of the space and the presence of Judaism and so on and so forth, but the contribution or the presence of Arabic people was completely erased, right? So just because they were there in the language doesn't mean that they were there in fact, right? Or even symbolically, right? So looking at the linguistic landscape as as a political space. And you know, I use that example because it's out there, it's published, it's no, you know, it's just, you know, and it's important. But you could do the same thing with the school. I had a student last fall do an analysis of the linguistic landscape of her school, and realized that there were posters, there were with famous people and so on and so forth, not one Black person. Right? Now, how are you going to go and tell me that you're celebrating historical figures in North American culture that have contributed to history, science, and so on and so forth, and you cannot have one, you know, I don't know, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, I don't know, Martin Luther King. I mean, I was trying to find something less obvious, you know, Ray Charles. I mean, you name it, you know, the people who created the radiator, I forget their name. In any case, Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize of Literature. I mean, things like this, you know, so she's like, all right, so she made a proposal. So she looked at this, she gave her study, but she took it one step further, meaning that she actually she crafted a proposal that she's hoping to present at her former high school board, saying, you guys need to do a better job. And she's not Black, you know, but she looks at this and is like, if we are serious about diversity and inclusion efforts, we need to make the schoolscape more diverse and inclusive, because otherwise only one segment of the student population gets themselves represented in there. And this is where I find L2 education can be really leveraged into bigger and better things. And why we matter is because there is no other place except maybe history, but I'm not sure, or social science should be doing this. And again, if you're teaching in the K-12 system, reach out to those colleagues in social sciences and history and see if you can work together on this, because sometimes by studying these things through other cultures, it sort of diffuses attention a little bit, but ultimately you want to turn it into action so that you can change the landscape where you are and make it better, right? And that's a tall order perhaps, but that I think that's something to shoot for, you know.
All right, so we have more questions. I'm just going to take one, and we'll leave the rest because we're just kind of running out of time right now. Someone else is saying, I'm teaching composition courses to second language students, most of whom are international students. One of their writing assignment is an ad analysis, and I find that they have difficulty analyzing and interpreting a piece of ad in an academic way. Their interpretations look so random. To what extent can a teacher allow them to interpret it? How can we assess their writing in a college level composition class? Should students do some research about the background information of the ad before interpreting it?
That's such a terrific question. Ads are their own animal altogether. I mean, they're such a long-standing genre of communication, right? I mean, they've been going on for a long time. That's both a good news and a bad news. The bad news that there is a lot. The good news is that it's not hard to find, even for you as an instructor, to find materials to help you unpack how ads are made, right? Again, this is a question of generic convention. You know, when ad makers make ads, what are some of the things that they're taking into consideration, right? There's the client, how they're trying to portray themselves, right? I mean, how is it that every time I see an ad for an oil company, it's like all companies are going to save the world? I mean, it's completely absurd, right? But they're masterful at communication that way, right? And so, this is not. I used to work with. There was a couple of ads for a while that, coming out of the French context, that really made me laugh, and so I used them and used to teach them. But I haven't touched that in a while. So I'm sure now it's even easier to find material both for you as a teacher, to become more proficient at how to unpack ads, but also things that are probably accessible to your students that they can read, so that they can to inform them. And if you teach a foreign language, it doesn't matter if that tool that they can read at home is in English, right? I have a nice little cheat sheet about questions to ask when starting an ad. And then as with any other kind of text, the moment of interpretation goes with what is said, right? I mean, it's the same goes with pragmatics, right? In in verbal communication, there is what is said, and there's what is intended, and then there's the effect, right? The same is true with an ad. What is said? What do we see if it's a audiovisual ad, or if it's a poster or whatever? But let's unpack the text as text. What is the language that is in there that is designed to make meaning? And then let's try to unpack the other stuff, the stuff we don't see. You know, who is the author? What is the ad for? What is the intention? What is the ideology? Who is the targeted customer? Is it effective? Why is it? Why is it not effective? And then if it's an ad coming out of, it'd be even, you know, it'd be kind of cool coming out of a different country and culture. Do that work in that cultural context. Don't interpret it through the lens of North American culture, right? If it's an ad for a French audience, what does it tell you about the French audience, right? What are the, you know, like what I was, the ads that I showed you about the Breiscola, for example, that's not born in a vacuum. You know, if you know the history of Brittany, the way Britons like to portray themselves, how they're being portrayed by other French people, and so on and so forth. And then you get this and you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense, you know? And so all of this work needs to be done. But if all of this seems overwhelming, it's not supposed to be. But I will say this, though. This is one of those things that goes through the less is more approach, meaning that you could gallop through an ad and say, oh yeah, 15 minutes, we've unpacked the ad, and now let's all go home and be happy. Or you could say, hey, let's work on this one ad for a week, and we're going to unpack it for all it's worth, so that we may only do one ad and not three, but at least next time you see an ad, you'll know exactly how to unpack it and what questions to ask, and so on and so forth, right? So galloping through the curriculum, I gave that up a long time ago, because I really think it's more important to try to anchor good habits and good tools in student, and have them acquire these tools deeper, or more deeply, I should say. Let's use an adverb there for a second. Then just galloping through everything, and then by the end of the semester, you're like, okay, so what did you learn, or what do you remember? Right. So that's just me.
Great. Thank you so much, Sebastien. So hopefully some of you will be joining us for our next webinar on April 7th, I believe, which will also be looking at multimodality of web text. Thank you so much, everybody.